That morning, no one expected a single act of defiance to change military history. What began as routine training became a moment every soldier on base would remember, and one that would test the difference between following orders and doing what's right. The cold Hereford rain fell in a steady drizzle, turning the parade square at Credenhill into a slick expanse of grey. It was just after 0600 hours, and the air carried the sharp tang of wet concrete and polished leather. Lance Corporal Ellis Harper stood at the edge of the formation, her boots planted firmly on the damp gravel, shoulders squared under the weight of her camouflage jacket. She was one of the quieter ones in the platoon, 28 years old, with a face that rarely betrayed more than a flicker of resolve. Her beret sat precisely aligned on her short-cropped hair, the cap badge catching the faint light from the barracks windows. Sergeant Major Reynolds barked the orders from the front, his voice cutting through the downpour like a bayonet. "Platoon, attention!" The ranks snapped to, heels striking the ground in unison, a rhythmic thud that echoed off the low-slung buildings of the base. Credenhill was the heart of Hereford's military district, home to the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, though most of the soldiers drilling here were from the regular army units attached for joint exercises. The SAS presence was felt more than seen, shadows in the distance, whispers in the mess hall, but it lent an undercurrent of expectation to every routine. Ellis had been with the battalion for 18 months, transferred in from a posting in Aldershot after a stint that no one quite knew the details of. She didn't talk about it, and the others didn't press. In the British Army, you earned your place through deeds, not stories. And Ellis's deeds were competent but unremarkable. Always first to volunteer for the night watch, her rifle drill flawless, her kit inspections passing without a murmur. Yet there was a reserve to her, a way she held herself slightly apart, as if measuring the world through eyes that had seen more than the parade square. To her left stood Private Jenkins, a lanky lad from Manchester, barely out of his teens and full of the brash energy that came with it. He'd taken to calling her ghost behind her back, said she moved like one, silent and insubstantial. Ellis heard the jibes but let them slide. Response would only invite more. The platoon formed up for the morning inspection, rifles slung at the slope, chins tucked in. Reynolds paced the line, his boots splashing faintly in the puddles, eyes scanning for the slightest flaw. "Harper!" The sergeant major's voice halted at her position. Ellis's posture didn't waver, but her gaze met his, steadily, unblinking. "Your webbing's off. Again. Standards, Lance Corporal. We're not running a holiday camp here." It wasn't off. Ellis had checked it twice in the dim light of the barrack room, but she nodded once, lips pressed thin. "Understood, Sergeant Major." Her voice was even, clipped, carrying the neutral accent of someone who'd spent years smoothing out regional edges. Reynolds moved on, but Jenkins snickered under his breath, nudging the private next to him. "Ghost strikes again. Bet she polishes that beret in her sleep." The drill continued, transitioning to a tactical march around the perimeter. The rain picked up, drumming against the hoods they'd pulled low. Ellis kept pace, effortlessly, her steps measured, breathing controlled. She'd run worse in the mud of the break-on beacons, though that was a memory she kept locked away. The platoon sergeant, a wiry man named Corporal Tate, led the file, calling out directions with the dry precision of a man who'd served 2 tours in Helmand. "Left wheel, march!" As they rounded the corner near the vehicle sheds, the formation tightened. Ellis felt the subtle shift in rhythm, Jenkins lagging just enough to brush against her elbow. It wasn't the first time. He'd been testing boundaries since her arrival, small provocations masked as clumsiness. Today, as they halted for a head count, he stumbled forward, his hand catching the brim of her beret. It wasn't a slap, not yet, but the tug was deliberate, sending the cap tumbling into the mud. The platoon froze. A ripple of muffled laughter spread from the rear ranks. Jenkins straightened, feigning surprise. "Sorry, Harper. Slippery out here." His eyes held a glint of challenge, waiting for her to react, to snap back, to demand an apology. But Ellis didn't. She bent slowly, retrieving the beret with gloved fingers, the wet wool heavy in her grasp. Water streamed down her face, but her expression remained impassive, jaw set in quiet resolve. She wiped the mud from the badge with her thumb, then replaced it on her head, aligning it perfectly. Reynolds, overseeing from the side, noted the incident but said nothing. In the hierarchy of the base, such squabbles were beneath notice unless they disrupted the chain. "Carry on," he ordered, and the march resumed. Ellis fell back into step, her mind turning inward. The rain masked any tremor in her hands, but inside, the old instinct stirred, a flicker of the discipline forged in places far from Hereford's orderly squares. By 0800 they were back on the drill square, dismissed for breakfast in the mess hall. The air inside was thick with the aroma of strong tea and boiled eggs, the clatter of trays a welcome contrast to the morning's chill. Ellis queued silently, her beret now stowed in her pocket, hair still damp. Jenkins and his mates claimed a table nearby, their voices low but carrying. "Think she's got a spine under all that silence?" one muttered. Ellis loaded her tray, porridge, toast, a mug of builder's tea, and chose a seat alone by the window, overlooking the sodden fields. She ate methodically, gaze fixed on the steam rising from her cup. The base hummed with its daily rhythm. Cooks shouting orders in the kitchen, the distant rumble of a Land Rover on the access road. Unseen, a group of visitors had arrived earlier that week, SAS officers from the regiment's headquarters, here for a liaison briefing. They moved through the corridors like ghosts themselves, their presence announced only by the faint click of polished boots on linoleum. One of them, a major with a face weathered by years in the shadows, paused at the mess hall door. His eyes, sharp beneath a low brow, scanned the room. They lingered, just for a moment, on the lone figure by the window. But he said nothing, turning away with the stillness that marked his kind. The morning pressed on, routine unbroken, the tension coiling like mist over the training yards. Ellis finished her meal, stacking her tray with care. As she rose, Jenkins called out from across the hall, his tone laced with mock camaraderie. "Oi, Ghost, fancy a rematch on the square later?" Laughter followed, but she didn't turn. Instead, she walked out into the rain, posture unbroken, the weight of unspoken history settling heavier on her shoulders. The day was young, and Credenhill's secrets ran deep. The rain had eased to a fine mist by the time Ellis reached the armory block, her boots leaving faint imprints on the wet path. Credenhill's layout was a study in efficient geometry. Low brick buildings huddled against the Welsh borders, their roofs slick with perpetual damp. She pushed through the heavy door, the hinges groaning softly, and stepped into the ordered hush of the equipment store. The air inside was warmer, laced with the metallic scent of gun oil and the faint, earthy residue of cordite from the range the day before. Corporal Tate was already there, clipboard in hand, overseeing the morning's kit sign-out. He was a solid man in his mid-30s, with the lean build of someone who'd humped Bergens across the South Downs more times than he cared to count. "Harper," he greeted her with a nod, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of a career non-commissioned officer. Rifle and sidearm, standard load for the afternoon's live fire. Ellis acknowledged him with a brief "Corporal," moving to her allocated locker. She worked methodically, unlocking it with a key from her lanyard, her gloved hand steady as she drew out the SA-80 and holstered pistol. Each piece was inspected in silence, barrel checked for cleanliness, magazine seated with a soft click, sling adjusted to regulation length. Tate watched from the corner of his eye, noting the precision that bordered on ritual. She'd been like this since day one, no wasted motion, no chatter to fill the quiet. In a unit where banter was the glue holding the ranks together, her reserve stood out like a shadow in the drill square. "Everything square?" Tate asked, more out of form than doubt. He knew her scores from the last assessment, top marks in marksmanship, endurance runs completed without a murmur. But whispers persisted. Some said she was coasting, others that she'd washed out of something bigger before landing here. "Affirmative," Ellis replied, her tone level, eyes on her task. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and signed the log, the pen scratching faintly against the paper. As she turned to leave, Private Jenkins entered, shaking water from his jacket like a dog fresh from the river. He was with Lance Corporal Briggs, a stocky Geordie with a perpetual squint from too many hours squinting down sights. "Morning, sunshine," Jenkins said to Ellis, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Briggs chuckled, low and rumbling, as they moved to their own lockers. Ellis didn't break stride, exiting into the mist-shrouded yard where the platoon was reassembling for the mid-morning brief. The parade square stretched out before her, its gravel pitted from countless boots, the Union Jack drooping limply from the flagpole in the center. Beyond it, the training towers loomed, grey silhouettes against the overcast sky, remnants of the SAS selection courses that filtered through these grounds. Sergeant Major Reynolds had the formation under his eye already, the platoon standing easy in 3 ranks, privates at the rear, lance corporals like Ellis in the middle, the NCOs up front. It was the backbone of British Army life, hierarchy etched into every stance, every salute. Reynolds, with his campaign ribbons glinting faintly under his jacket, paced before them, his presence a bulwark against complacency. Right, listen in. Afternoons on the range, section attacks, live rounds, no cock-ups. We're guests here at Credenhill. Don't give the regiment reason to think we're soft. The words hung in the air, a reminder of the invisible line between regular forces and the elite shadows that trained in the hills beyond the wire. Ellis stood at attention when the brief ended, her gaze fixed on a point just above Reynolds' shoulder. Jenkins, 2 files over, shifted his weight, muttering something to Briggs that elicited a stifled snort. "Ghosts probably dreaming of tea and biscuits," he whispered, loud enough for the rank to hear. A few heads turned, but no one laughed outright, not with Reynolds still in earshot. The sergeant major dismissed them to prepare, and the platoon dispersed in orderly fashion, some to the cookhouse for a quick elevensies, others to the vehicle park to draw up the Land Rovers. Ellis opted for the former, joining the queue in the mess hall annex. The space was utilitarian, long trestle tables scarred from years of use, walls papered in faded institutional green, the hiss of a kettle on the boil providing a constant underscore. She collected a mug of tea, black and strong, and a slice of fruitcake wrapped in greaseproof paper, then found her spot by the same window as before. The fields outside rolled away towards the River Wye, shrouded in haze, the distant lowing of cattle a faint intrusion on the base's rhythm. Corporal Tate slid onto the bench opposite her, uninvited but not unwelcome. He was one of the few who treated her as an equal, perhaps sensing the steel beneath the silence. "Heard about the Beret earlier," he said quietly, stirring sugar into his own mug. "Jenkins is a prat. Testing you, like." Ellis met his eyes briefly, her expression unchanging. "It's nothing, Corporal." She took a sip of tea, the heat grounding her. In truth, it was everything, a small erosion of the respect she'd built through quiet competence, but speaking it aloud would fracture the discipline she clung to, the same that had carried her through nights in far-off dust and shadow. Tate nodded, accepting the deflection. "Fair enough, just watch your back on the range. Lads like him get sloppy under fire." He finished his tea and stood, clapping her shoulder lightly before heading out. Ellis remained, watching the steam curl from her mug, her mind tracing the contours of the day ahead. The range at Credenhill was unforgiving, muddy fire breaks, pop-up targets that tested nerve as much as aim. She'd excel there, as always, her shots grouping tight, her commands steady if called upon. But the mockery lingered, a subtle undercurrent in the platoon's easy camaraderie. By 1100 hours, the unit was kitted out and mounting up. Ellis climbed into the back of a Defender, rifle between her knees, as the convoy rumbled towards the training area. The mist clung to the windscreen, wipers sweeping rhythmically, the driver navigating the narrow lanes flanked by hedgerows. Sergeant Reynolds rode up front in the lead vehicle, his radio crackling with terse updates. All call signs, maintain spacing, Echo Tango Oscar. Private Jenkins was in the same wagon, squeezed in beside her, his knee bumping hers deliberately on a turn. "Range day, eh? Bet you shoot like a girl, Ghost." His mates in the front laughed, but Ellis simply adjusted her position, staring out at the passing countryside. The hills of Hereford rose gently, dotted with sheep, their wool heavy with rain, a landscape that bred resilience, much like the soldiers it housed. They arrived at the range an hour later, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and heather. The firing points were marked out in whitewash, butts manned by range wardens in yellow vests. Reynolds oversaw the safety brief, his voice carrying over the wind. "Weapons downrange only, ceasefire on command. Understood?" The platoon chorused, "Yes, Sergeant Major," and took positions. Ellis settled into her slot, prone on the bipod, sighting through the SUSAT. The first string began, a controlled burst at 200 meters. Her trigger pull was smooth. The rifle's report muffled by the suppressor, rounds punching paper with mechanical precision. Tate, scoring from the side, gave a thumbs up. Even Jenkins, firing nearby, couldn't fault it, though he tried with a muttered, "lucky shot," as he reloaded. The session stretched into the afternoon, rotations between attack drills and snap targets. Ellis moved with the quiet efficiency that defined her. Covering arcs without fanfare, her voice on the net calm and authoritative when directing a flank. By stand-down, the platoon was mud-spattered and weary, but cohesive. As they policed brass and stowed gear, Reynolds pulled her aside briefly. "Solid work, Harper. Keep it up." It was praise, sparse as it was, but it landed like a rare patch of sun through the clouds. Back at base as dusk gathered, the routine wound down, kit clean and hung, evening meal in the mess. Ellis sat alone again, the day's tensions uncoiling in the warmth of the hall. Whispers followed her, Jenkins holding court at his table, recounting the range with embellished flair, but she tuned them out, focusing on the simple act of eating. The hierarchy held, the order endured. Yet beneath it, the cracks widened, unseen forces stirring in the regiment's quiet watch. The evening meal in the mess hall carried on, with the subdued hum of a long day's end. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pallid glow on the trestle tables, laden with plates of shepherd's pie, peas and mugs of tea gone lukewarm. Ellis Harper methodically worked through her portion, fork scraping against the enamel, her posture straight even in repose. The warmth seeped into her bones, easing the ache from the range, but the undercurrent of the day's slights lingered like the faint echo of rifle reports. Private Jenkins held forth at his table, his voice rising in bursts of laughter as he regaled his cluster of mates. Briggs, a couple of other privates, and even Lance Corporal Mills from the signals section. And there she is, Ghost Harper, popping off rounds like she's in a bleeding dream. Didn't flinch once, did she? Probably 'cause she's half asleep already. The group chuckled, forks pausing mid-air, the mockery light but pointed, a way to unwind the discipline of the afternoon. Jenkins leaned back, arms crossed, his eyes flicking towards Ellis's solitary spot by the window. She felt the weight of it, but kept her gaze on her plate, chewing steadily, the salt of the pie grounding her. Corporal Tate entered then, tray in hand, scanning for a seat. He nodded to Reynolds, who sat at the head table with a few sergeants, poring over a clipboard of the day's scores. Tate veered towards Ellis, but Jenkins called out before he could settle. "Oi, Tate, join the living, yeah? Over here." Harper's got her own ghost convention going. More laughter rippled out, drawing glances from nearby tables. Even the cooks in the serving hatch paused, wiping hands on aprons, their faces neutral but attentive. Tate hesitated, then slid onto the bench opposite Ellis anyway, his presence a quiet buffer. "Ignore the noise, Harper," he murmured, low enough for only her ears. Jenkins is all mouth, no follow-through. She met his eyes for a fraction of a second, a subtle incline of her head, her only reply. The corporal dug into his meal, the clink of cutlery a small anchor in the swelling banter. But Jenkins wasn't done. He pushed back from his table, tray balanced precariously, and sauntered over as if on a casual stroll. His mates trailed a step behind, Briggs smirking, Mills hanging back with feigned indifference. The mess hall's rhythm faltered slightly, soldiers sensing the shift, conversations dipping as heads turned. Jenkins stopped at Ellis's table, looming just enough to cast a shadow over her plate. "Room for one more, Ghost? Or you saving space for your invisible friends?" Ellis didn't look up, continuing to eat with measured bites. Silence was her shield, honed from years where words could unravel more than they built. Tate cleared his throat. "Jenkins, finish your grub and sod off. Not the time." Jenkins ignored him, reaching out with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. His hand clamped onto Ellis's wrist as she lifted her mug, the grip firm, not bruising but insistent, pulling her arm down to the table with a thud that spilled tea across the wood. "Come on, Harper. Lighten up. We're all mates here." The liquid spread, soaking into the bread on her plate, the sharp scent of it cutting through the hall's steam. A hush fell, heavier than the rain outside. Reynolds glanced up from his clipboard, his brow furrowing, but he held his position, waiting to see if it escalated beyond petty squabbles. The other tables stilled, forks hovering, the hierarchy's unspoken rule in play. Juniors sorted their own messes unless blood was drawn. Jenkins released her wrist with a mock flourish, but not before twisting slightly, enough to knock her tray sideways. The plate tipped, shepherd's pie sliding onto the bench, peas scattering like spent casings across the floor. Laughter erupted from his group, sharp and fleeting, but it died quick under the weight of the room's stares. "Whoops," Jenkins said, stepping back with hands raised. "Clumsy me. You'll get it cleaned up, yeah? Standards and all that." His eyes dared her to snap, to shove, to break the reserve that made her an easy target. Ellis's hand remained where it had fallen, fingers curling slowly around the mug's handle, the warmth now cooling against her skin. Her face stayed impassive, jawline taut but unbroken, eyes fixed on the spill as if cataloguing it for later report. No outburst, no retort, just the quiet dignity of endurance, the kind that spoke of deeper trials weathered without fanfare. She rose then, methodically righting the tray, stacking the remnants with care. The peas crunched under her boot as she shifted, but she didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the mess beyond a steady breath. Tate stood halfway, ready to intervene, but Ellis waved him down with a subtle gesture. Permission not needed, but granted nonetheless. She carried the tray to the hatch, handing it off to a cook with a murmured ta, then returned with a cloth from the sideboard. Kneeling to wipe the bench and floor, her movements were precise, unhurried, the cloth absorbing the tea without a trace of haste. The platoon watched in that suspended moment, the mockery's edge blunted by her silence, turning awkward in the face of it. Jenkins shifted, discomfort creeping into his stance, the laughter from his mates now forced, trailing off. "Right, whatever," he muttered, retreating to his table, but the damage hung in the air, a public diminishment, staged under the mess hall's unforgiving light. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice carrying like a whip crack. "Enough of that. Clean your own kit, Jenkins, and think on your manners." It was mild rebuke, but it landed, the sergeant major's authority reasserting the order. Ellis finished, folding the cloth neatly and placing it aside, then resumed her seat as if nothing had transpired. Tate shook his head, resuming his meal in quiet solidarity. The hall stirred back to life, clatter resuming, voices low, but the incident rippled outward, whispers threading through the ranks like mist through the barracks. Outside, the Hereford night deepened, the base's lights pooling on the wet paths, Credenhill's rigid discipline holding firm even as personal fractures widened. In the quiet of her bunk later, Ellis lay staring at the ceiling, the day's weight settling like damp wool. The wrist bore a faint red mark, already fading, but the humiliation etched deeper. A test of resolve she met with the same inner steel that had carried her through shadows long past. The regiment's visitors lingered in her thoughts, their unseen eyes, the subtle watch that promised more than the routine ever did. Tomorrow's drills would come at dawn, boots on gravel, orders barked anew. But the coil tightened, unseen, waiting for the moment when silence gave way to reckoning. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far stories of courage and integrity can reach. The first light of dawn crept over Credenhill like a reluctant recruit, grey and unyielding, the mist hanging low over the parade square. Ellis Harper rose before reveille, her bunk creaking faintly under her weight as she swung her legs to the cold linoleum floor. The barrack room was still, save for the soft snores of her section mates, the air thick with the residue of yesterday's damp uniforms hung to dry on the radiator. She dressed in silence, camouflage trousers tucked into boots, shirt buttoned to regulation, her movements a ritual of precision honed over years. The faint red mark on her wrist from Jenkins's grip had vanished overnight, but the memory of it pulsed like a distant echo, a reminder to keep her guard as tight as her kit. By 05:30 she was outside, breath fogging in the chill as she jogged the perimeter track, the gravel crunching underfoot. The base stirred slowly, distant clangs from the cookhouse, the low rumble of a generator powering the ops room. Credenhill's mornings carried a particular weight, the proximity to the SAS headquarters infusing every routine with an undercurrent of scrutiny. Ellis kept her pace steady, lungs burning just enough to clear the mind, her thoughts turning to the day ahead. More drills, perhaps a kit inspection, the unyielding rhythm that defined life in the ranks. Reveille sounded at 600, the bugle's call piercing the fog, pulling the platoon from their bunks in a cascade of boots and muffled curses. Ellis fell in on the square, beret aligned, rifle at the slope, her position in the middle rank unremarkable amid the formation. Sergeant Major Reynolds took the muster, his voice a steady bark. Platoon. Report. Names rolled out in order, the responses crisp, the hierarchy reasserting itself with each affirmation. Jenkins stood 2 files away, his posture sloppy, eyes avoiding hers as if the mess hall incident had left a sour taste even for him. No jibes this morning. The rebuke from Reynolds had tempered the banter, at least for now. The morning schedule was standard. Physical training followed by a briefing on joint exercises. As the platoon double-timed to the PT area, a cluster of vehicles pulled up at the edge of the square, 3 unmarked Land Rovers, their plates obscured by mud from the border roads. From them emerged a small group, no more than 6 men clad in subdued civilian attire over tactical vests, faces shadowed by low-pulled caps. They moved with the economy of purpose that marked the regiment. No salutes exchanged, no chatter, just a quiet conferral with the base adjutant before dispersing towards the observation tower. Whispers threaded through the platoon as they formed up for circuits. "SAS, lads," Corporal Tate murmured to Ellis during a water break, his eyes flicking towards the tower. "Liaison for the upcoming op sim. Keep it tight, they don't miss much." Ellis nodded once, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She'd heard the rumors. The visitors were from Hereford proper, evaluating regular units for integration tasks, their gaze as piercing as the Welsh wind. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing on the run, laps around the assault course. Mud sucking at her boots, the burn in her calves a welcome distraction. Midway through, as the platoon scaled the low wall, one of the visitors appeared at the fence line. He was tall, mid-40s perhaps, with the lean frame of a man who'd shed excess long ago. No insignia marked him, but the way he stood, still hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning without hurry, betrayed his rank. Major, Ellis guessed, from the subtle authority in his posture. He watched the formation navigate the cargo net, his gaze lingering not on the leaders, but on the quieter ones, those who moved without flourish. Ellis crested the wall cleanly, dropping to the mats below with a controlled roll, her breathing even. As she rose, her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing the edge of a tattoo on her inner forearm, a faint outline of a winged dagger, the regiment's insignia, inked in black and faded from time. She tugged the cuff down instinctively, but not before the major's eyes caught it. He didn't react overtly, no nod, no raised brow, just a subtle shift in his stance, the stillness deepening as if a piece had slotted into place. The platoon pressed on, oblivious, but Ellis felt the weight of observation, a prickle at the base of her neck like the first drops of rain. PT wrapped at 800, the platoon dispersing to the ablutions block for a quick wash before breakfast. Ellis lingered in the changing room, stripping off her sweat-soaked top under the harsh strip lights. The tattoo was her only indulgence from the past, a mark from a selection course she'd barely survived, one that led to a posting cut short by circumstances classified even from her own chain. She traced it absently with her thumb, the skin rough from scar tissue beneath, before pulling on a fresh shirt. No one in the platoon knew. She'd ensured it that way, her silence a barrier thicker than any fence. In the mess hall, the routine resumed. Cues for porridge and bacon, the sizzle of fat on the griddle mingling with the steam from urns of tea. Ellis took her tray to the window seat as always, but today the space felt exposed. The major entered with 2 of his group, trays minimal, black coffee, toast, no frills. They chose a table near the door, backs to the wall, conversation in low tones that carried no further than their circle, yet his eyes swept the room periodically, methodical, and once more they paused on her. Not staring, but noting, the way she held her mug with a grip that spoke of familiarity with heavier weights, the precise angle of her posture even at rest. Jenkins and his lot were at their usual table, subdued after yesterday, but Briggs muttered something that drew a snort. "Ghosts got company today. Think the spooks are scouting for poltergeists?" Jenkins glanced her way, smirk fading when he spotted the visitors. The Major's presence had that effect. Even the banter hushed, the hierarchy extending invisibly to include these shadows. As Ellis finished her meal, stacking her tray with care, the Major rose. He passed her table on the way out, his pace unhurried, boots silent on the linoleum. At the hatch he handed off his own tray, then turned slightly, his voice pitched just for her ears, a murmur softer than the rain pattering against the glass. "Lance Corporal." No more, no question, just the acknowledgement, laced with a weight that bypassed ranks. Her hand stilled on the tray, eyes meeting his for a beat, steady, unblinking. Recognition flickered there, not surprise, but confirmation of something long buried. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then exited into the mist, his companions falling in without a word. The mess hall exhaled, conversations resuming, but Ellis sat a moment longer, the echo of her name, or the absence of it, hanging in the air. The tattoo itched faintly under her sleeve, a ghost from operations in shadowed valleys, where she'd pulled 2 SAS troopers from a compromised patrol under fire that no report would ever detail. Classified, compartmentalized, forgotten by all but the regiment. The morning briefing followed in the ops tent, canvas flapping gently in the breeze, the air inside heavy with the scent of chalk dust and stale coffee. Reynolds outlined the day's tasks, vehicle maintenance drills, followed by a section-level navigation exercise in the hills. The visitors sat at the back, notebooks open, but pens idle, their presence a silent pressure on the room. Ellis stood with her section, notebook in hand, jotting notes with the same economy as her movements. When the Major's gaze drifted her way again, it was on the subtle scar peeking from her collar, her graze from that same night, dismissed as training mishap in her transfer papers. No words passed, no gestures overt. But as the platoon filed out, he lingered by the flap, watching her integrate seamlessly into the group, directing a private on his map reading with a quiet correction, her voice level, authoritative without volume. Jenkins, fumbling his own gear nearby, caught none of it, his focus on complaints about the weather. The Major's stillness spoke volumes, respect, unspoken, born of shared shadows. By midday, the platoon was in the vehicle park, engines idling as they practiced convoy formations. Ellis crewed the second defender, checking tires and fuel with Tate, her hands sure on the tools. From the observation post atop the sheds, the SAS group watched, binoculars trained not on the vehicles, but on the handlers. The Major lowered his, turning to his second with a faint tilt of the head, toward her. No elaboration needed. In the regiment, hints sufficed, building to a picture only they could see. The day wore on, routines unbroken, but the coil tightened. Ellis felt it in the air, like the hush before a squall over the Wye. Observation turning to intent, her hidden past brushing against the present like a sleeve caught on barbed wire. Credenhill's discipline held, rigid and unyielding, but beneath it, the visitor's quiet notice promised a reckoning subtle as the mist rolling in from the hills. The afternoon sun broke through the persistent overcast like a hesitant intruder, casting long shadows across the vehicle park at Credenhill. The platoon had just wrapped the navigation exercise, mud-caked boots scraping against the gravel as they reassembled in loose formation near the Land Rovers. Sweat mingled with the damp of the hills, the air carrying the faint, acrid tang of diesel from the idling engines. Sergeant Major Reynolds stood at the front, clipboard in hand, calling out after-action notes in his measured baritone. "Section leads. Debrief your teams. Timings were tight, but navigation errors cost us 10 minutes on the return leg. Learn from it." Ellis Harper wiped a streak of dirt from her cheek, her camouflage jacket clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She'd led her fire team through the exercise without flaw, her compass work precise, directions given in low, steady commands that kept them on bearing through the bracken-choked paths. Corporal Tate had nodded approval as they crested the final ridge, but the praise was unspoken, folded into the rhythm of the march back. Now, as the platoon milled about, Stowing maps, checking Bergens, Jenkins sidled up to her again, his earlier restraint from the morning's scrutiny evidently worn thin. He was with Briggs, the two of them hauling gear from the rear of a Defender, their faces flushed from the exertion. "Ghost pulls it off again," Jenkins said loud enough for the nearby section to hear, his voice laced with that familiar edge. He hefted a Bergen onto his shoulder, then let it drop with a thud, sending a spray of mud towards her boots. "Must be all that practice haunting the hills. Bet you know these paths better than the locals, eh?" Briggs guffawed, slapping his thigh, and a couple of privates nearby joined in with half-hearted chuckles, the sound echoing off the parked vehicles like distant small arms fire. Ellis didn't rise to it. She knelt to secure her own kit, fingers working the straps with deliberate care, her expression unchanging. The mockery had become a pattern, a way for Jenkins to reclaim ground after Reynolds' warning. But she met it with the same impassive front, jaw set, eyes forward, the internal resolve a fortress against the barbs. Tate glanced over from where he was folding a map, his brow knitting, but he held his tongue, sensing the tension coiling once more. It was then that the visitors reappeared, materializing from the direction of the observation post, like figures stepping from the mist. The Major led them, his pace unhurried, flanked by two others in the same subdued attire. No berets, no overt insignia, just the quiet authority that parted the platoon without a word. Reynolds straightened immediately, snapping a salute that the Major returned with a minimal nod. "Sergeant Major, mind if we join for the closeout?" The Major's voice was even, carrying the neutral vowels of southern England, honed smooth by years of briefings in secure rooms. "Of course, sir," Reynolds replied, stepping aside. The platoon snapped to attention instinctively, the formation tightening as the SAS group took position at the front. Whispers died. Even Jenkins straightened, his smirk fading under the weight of their presence. The Major scanned the ranks, his gaze methodical, pausing briefly on faces before settling, almost imperceptibly, on Ellis. She stood at ease in her place, rifle slung, posture rigid but unremarkable amid the line. "Carry on with your debrief," the Major said to Reynolds, who resumed, outlining the exercise's key takeaways: flank security, radio discipline, the unforgiving terrain of the Welsh borders. The platoon listened, heads up, but the undercurrent shifted. The visitor's stillness amplified every word, turning routine into something observed, evaluated. As Reynolds wrapped up, calling for questions, Jenkins, emboldened perhaps by the formal setting, couldn't resist. He raised a hand, casual but pointed. "Sergeant Major on the nav. Harper's team cut corners on the eastern ridge. Nearly lost the plot there, didn't we, Ghost?" The name landed like a pebble in still water, ripples spreading through the ranks. A few snickers bubbled up from the rear, Briggs shifting to suppress a grin. Reynolds' eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the Major interjected, his voice cutting clean through the air. "Harper." It wasn't a question, nor raised in volume, just the name, spoken with the clarity of a call sign on the net, carrying across the park without effort. The platoon froze. Ellis's head lifted slowly, her eyes meeting the Major's for the first time openly. No surprise registered on her face, only that steady resolve. But inside, the coil unwound fractionally, a recognition long anticipated, now inevitable. Jenkins turned pale, his hand dropping as if burned, the smirk evaporating into confusion. "Sir," Reynolds ventured, glancing between them, the hierarchy bending under the unspoken. The Major stepped forward, his boots silent on the gravel, closing the distance to the formation's edge. His companions remained still behind him, faces impassive, but their postures spoke of shared knowledge. He regarded Ellis directly, the silence stretching like the pause before a ceasefire. "Lance Corporal Harper, or should I say Echo from the QRF in the Hindu Kush 2012. The words were measured, not accusatory, but they landed with the weight of declassified files, pulling the veil from her past in front of the assembled ranks. A murmur rippled through the platoon, soft intakes of breath, heads turning. Jenkins's face drained further, his eyes widening as fragments of base gossip collided with reality. Tate stood rigid beside her, piecing it together. The tattoo glimpsed earlier, the precision that outstripped routine training, Reynolds's clipboard lowered, his expression shifting from authority to dawning respect. The Major continued, his tone reserved, internal thunder wrapped in calm. "That night in Helmand, your quick reaction force pulled my Sabre squadron from a hot LZ. 2 birds down, exfil compromised. You held the ridge under fire, directed the dust off while taking grazing rounds. Classified op, black ink only. The regiment doesn't forget its debts." He didn't elaborate on the details, the dust-choked chaos, the SAS troopers she'd dragged to cover, her call sign echoing over the radio amid the crack of AK fire. But the implication hung transformative, rewriting her from ghost to guardian in their eyes. Ellis held his gaze, her posture unchanging, but a subtle softening touched her features, the release of years carrying that silence alone. No words from her. In British restraint, acknowledgement was in the stillness, the faint nod that mirrored his own. The Major raised his hand in a salute, crisp and formal, held just a beat longer than regulation. His companions followed suit, the gesture rippling through them like a silent order. The platoon, caught in the moment, felt the freeze. Shame creeping over Jenkins, who stared at the ground, pale and diminished. Respect rising in the others, postures straightening as the hierarchy realigned. Reynolds recovered first, his voice steady but laced with newfound gravity. "Platoon, attention." The ranks snapped to, heels grinding gravel, the air thick with the unspoken shift. The Major lowered his salute, nodding once to Ellis before turning to Reynolds. "Carry on, Sergeant Major. She's one of yours, but she's ours too." With that, he withdrew, the group melting back towards their vehicles, leaving the park in suspended hush. The debrief dissolved into murmurs as the platoon stood down, eyes flicking to Ellis with a mix of awe and apology. Jenkins slunk to the rear, avoiding her gaze, the colour returning to his face in splotches of regret. Tate clapped her shoulder lightly, a wordless, "Well done," while Reynolds approached, his expression one of quiet re-evaluation. "Harper, explains a lot. Kit inspection at 1600. Make it count." She nodded, slinging her Bergen, the weight lighter now. The sun dipped lower, gilding the wet paths as Credon Hill's routines resumed, but forever altered. The public reckoning had come, subtle as a shadow lifting, her hidden legacy etched into the base's unyielding stone. In the distance, the hills watched, silent witnesses to the honor reclaimed. The sun's fleeting warmth faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the vehicle park at Credon Hill shrouded in the encroaching grey of late afternoon. The platoon lingered in disarray, the usual post-exercise bustle replaced by a stunned hush, as if the Major's words had drawn an invisible cordon around the formation. Ellis Harper stood unmoving amid the ranks, her Bergen still slung over one shoulder, the strap digging into her camouflage jacket with familiar weight. The gravel beneath her boots felt firmer now, the ground itself bearing witness to the shift that rippled outward from her position. Sergeant Major Reynolds cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet, reasserting his authority with the subtle authority of habit. "Platoon, stand easy." The command broke the spell incrementally. Heels shifted, rifles adjusted, but eyes remained fixed, darting between Ellis and the retreating figures of the SAS group. The Major and his companions had already reached their Land Rovers, engines turning over with a low growl that carried across the park, but their departure felt like an echo, prolonging the moment. Jenkins hovered at the rear, his face still ashen, hands shoved deep into his pockets as if to hide their tremor. He avoided looking anywhere near Ellis, his earlier bravado evaporated into the damp air. Corporal Tate moved first, stepping closer to her side with the measured gait of a man processing layers beneath the surface. "Harper," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her alone, carrying the rough edges of quiet admiration. "Didn't see that coming. Echo, eh? Explains the way you handle a map like it's second nature." There was no probing for details, no demand for the classified fragments of that night in Helmand, just the acknowledgement, delivered with the restraint that defined their shared service. Ellis met his gaze briefly, a faint nod her response, the corner of her mouth twitching in what might have been relief, though her posture remained erect, unyielding. From the front, Reynolds approached, his clipboard tucked under one arm, the lines on his face deepening not with disapproval, but with a re-evaluation etched in every furrow. He stopped to pace away, eyes scanning her as if seeing the platoon through a new lens. Lance Corporal at ease. It was an order laced with permission, allowing her to lower her shoulders fractionally. The sergeant major's voice dropped, confidential yet firm. The regiment's mark isn't given lightly. If they'd pulled you for a word, I'd have understood, but this changes the brief. He paused, glancing towards the now empty track where the visitors had gone, the hedgerows swallowing their vehicles whole. Kit inspection at 1600, as I said. But from here on, you're leading the section nav review. Share what you can. Without the black ink, mind. The directive hung between them, a subtle promotion in tone if not in rank, the hierarchy bending to accommodate the revealed truth. Ellis absorbed it with a crisp, understood Sergeant Major at her words even, betraying none of the internal tide, the slow uncoiling of isolation that had wrapped her since her transfer. Around them, the platoon began to stir more fully, privates murmuring in clusters, their whispers no longer mocking but laced with a wary respect. Fragments of "heard she pulled them out under fire," threading through the air like smoke from a distant range. Briggs, standing with Jenkins, nudged his mate, but without the earlier glee, his voice low and edged with discomfort. "You heard that then? QRF in the cush, proper shadow stuff, and you went and—" He trailed off, shaking his head, the shame settling over him like the mist rolling in from the hills. Jenkins swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, and muttered something inaudible, eyes fixed on the toe of his boot scraping the gravel. The laughter that had fueled his provocations was gone, replaced by the weight of public correction, not from a superior's rebuke but from the unveiling of the woman he'd diminished. He slunk towards the vehicle line, hauling gear alone, his mates giving him space, the group's dynamic fracturing under the shared realization. Further along the ranks, Lance Corporal Mills from Signals approached Ellis tentatively, her notebook still clutched in one hand. "Harper, sorry, Echo, that ridge work you did today, it was textbook. If you've got tips from, well, back then, I'd take them." Her tone was earnest, stripped of the casual banter that had once excluded Ellis, now bridging the gap with quiet deference. Ellis inclined her head, responding with measured words. "Eastern bearings key in these hills. Compensate 5 degrees for the wind off the Y. We'll run it in the review." It was practical, unadorned advice, but it landed like an invitation, drawing Mills into a nod of agreement, the first thread of camaraderie weaving through the reserve. Reynolds oversaw the dispersal with renewed vigilance, his bark sharper now, directing the platoon to stow equipment and prepare for the evening stand-down. "Move it. Kit to the armory, no dawdling." The orders carried an undercurrent of reform, the routine infused with a heightened standard, as if the major's salute had elevated the entire unit's bearing. Ellis fell in with her section, directing the loading of the defenders with the same silent competence, but now heads turned to her for cues, privates stepping aside without protest. The park emptied methodically, boots crunching in unison, the clatter of Bergens and the scent of wet earth marking the transition back to base proper. As they marched the short distance to the barracks, the base seemed to hold its breath, the low buildings of Credenhill casting longer shadows, the flag on the pole stirring faintly in the breeze. Whispers followed Ellis like a wake, not the jibes of ghost, but murmurs of the one who held the ridge, the transformation subtle, internal, expressed in sidelong glances and straightened postures. Jenkins trailed at the rear, isolated in his pallor, the shame a personal reckoning that no order could erase. Tate walked beside her, offering no more words, just the solidarity of proximity, his presence a buffer against the lingering echoes. In the armory block, as the platoon signed in rifles and cleared weapons with the ritual precision of oiled bolts and chamber checks, Reynolds pulled Ellis aside once more. "Word from the adjutant. The visitors put in a note, positive. You're to report to the CO tomorrow for a quiet word." His eyes held hers, the respect rising clear in the clipped delivery. "Well earned, Harper. The regiment remembers. So will we." She nodded, the weight of the beret in her pocket feeling lighter. The tattoo beneath her sleeve no longer a hidden scar, but a badge reclaimed in the light of day. The evening meal approached, the mess hall's lights already flickering on against the deepening dusk, the aroma of stew and boiled potatoes wafting from the hatch. The platoon filed in, the hierarchy intact but realigned, seats shifting to include Ellis at the central tables, Jenkins opting for the periphery, his tray carried in silence. The base froze no longer in shock but in a quiet evolution, respect spreading like the first dry patch on dew-kissed gravel. Credenhill's rigid order endured, but now it honored the silent courage within, the moral steel that had bent injustice without breaking. From that moment, the Whispers changed, carrying her legacy forward on the wings of restrained British professionalism, the kind forged in rain-swept squares and shadowed operations, where true recognition came not in fanfare, but in the stillness of a shared salute. If this story already has your respect, hit the like button. It helps the story of Ellis Harper reach those who still believe in honor. The days following the revelation settled over Credenhill, like the persistent drizzle that softened the edges of its brick barracks, blurring the lines between routine and remembrance without erasing either. Ellis Harper moved through the base with the same measured stride, her boots striking the gravel paths in quiet rhythm. But the air around her had shifted, subtle as the tilt of a compass needle, realigning the invisible currents of the platoon. No longer did Jenkins or his mates test the boundaries with sidelong jabs or muttered asides. Their banter, once sharp and pointed, now skirted her entirely, confined to safer topics like the mud on the training lanes or the latest kit issue from stores. Jenkins himself kept to the rear ranks during drills, his posture more attentive, eyes downcast when she passed, the pallor of that afternoon in the vehicle park lingering in his averted gaze like a poorly healed bruise. Sergeant Major Reynolds adjusted the briefings accordingly, his voice carrying the same clipped authority, but with an undercurrent of directed respect when addressing her section. "Harper, take point on the next rotation, eastern flank as per your notes." It was no grand gesture, just the integration of her expertise into the order of things, her input on navigation and fire control woven into the platoon's playbook without fanfare. The others listened now, not with the obligatory nods of hierarchy, but with the quiet absorption of soldiers recognizing a peer forged in trials beyond their own. Corporal Tate became her unofficial second during exercises, deferring to her calls on the net with a brief, "Copy that," his earlier solidarity evolving into seamless partnership. Even Lance Corporal Mills sought her out in the quiet hours after stand-down, poring over maps in the common room. Her questions met with Ellis's reserved explanations, practical, unembellished, delivered over mugs of tea that steamed in the chill evening air. The base routines persisted, unyielding in their precision, reveille at dawn piercing the fog over the parade square, the sharp scent of wet concrete rising as formations snapped to attention. Kit inspections under Reynolds' unblinking eye, where Ellis's webbing passed without comment, a standard now elevated by implication. The mess hall, once an arena for petty skirmishes, hummed with subdued conversations, trays clattering in harmony rather than discord. Ellis took her meals at the central tables now, not by invitation, but by the natural drift of seats pulled out in her direction. Privates and lance corporals alike making space with nods rather than words. The aroma of boiled eggs and strong builder's tea filled the space, grounding the shift in something tangible, every day. Jenkins sat at the periphery, his laughter forced when it came at all. The group around him smaller, their eyes flicking towards her with a mix of curiosity and caution, as if her presence had redrawn the boundaries of camaraderie. Whispers threaded through the barracks, like the faint creak of floorboards underfoot at night, changed in tone, no longer mocking the ghost, but murmuring of echo, the call sign slipping into law with the reverence reserved for tales from the regiment's shadowed annals. In the ablutions block, as water hissed from taps and steam clouded the mirrors, privates speculated in low voices. Heard she held that ridge alone, SAS owed her their lives. It wasn't exaggeration. The Major's words had planted the seed, and the platoon's collective memory nurtured it, turning her from outlier to quiet legend, without the need for embellishment. Ellis overheard fragments during kit maintenance, her hands oiling the SA-80 with rhythmic strokes, but she neither confirmed nor denied, her silence amplifying the myth, a dignity earned through restraint. The transformation rippled outward, touching the base's broader rhythm. During a joint session with an attached signals troop, the adjutant referenced her in passing during the morning brief, Lance Corporal Harper's input on exfil protocols, drawing nods from the visiting NCOs, their postures straightening in subtle acknowledgement. The SAS liaison note, as Reynolds had mentioned, circulated quietly through the chain, prompting a formal commendation entry in her service record, though the details remained blacked out, classified ink preserving the veil. Ellis reported to the CO as ordered, the office sparse and functional, desk piled with folders, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering from some predecessor. The commanding officer, a colonel with the weathered lines of long service, met her gaze steadily over his spectacles. "The regiment speaks highly, Harper. Echoes actions in 12, exemplary. We'll see about advancement, but for now lead by example here." No effusive praise, just the clipped assurance of institutional respect, the hierarchy affirming her place without upending it. Evenings brought a deeper quiet, the floodlights pooling yellow on the paths as Ellis jogged the perimeter, the cool air off the Y carrying the distant low of cattle and the rustle of hedgerows. The tattoo on her forearm, once a private talisman, felt less like a burden now, its winged dagger a subtle link to the shadows that had shaped her. In the barrack room, as lights dimmed and the platoon settled into bunks, conversations turned reflective, stories of Hellman tours exchanged in hushed tones, Ellis's ridge holding woven in without her prompting, a thread in the tapestry of shared service. Jenkins, bunked across the aisle, offered no more provocations. One night, after a particularly grueling route march, he even passed her a water bottle during the break, mumbling, "Tar for the pace" earlier, his eyes meeting hers briefly before dropping away, the gesture a silent atonement, small but sincere. Credenhill endured, its rigid discipline the backbone of British military life. Boots echoing on the drill square at dawn, orders barked in the cold air over Aldershot-inspired yards, the quiet tension of hierarchy binding all. Yet from that day, Ellis became the embodiment of its deeper honour, moral courage unspoken, injustice met with unyielding poise, recognition earned not through clamour, but through the stillness of a salute. In the regiment's world of classified missions and hidden scars, such legacies lived on in the reserve of those who served, a quiet transformation that fortified the ranks against the rains of doubt, ensuring that silent honour, once revealed, echoed eternally through the parade grounds and beyond. Weeks turned to months at Credenhill, the relentless cycle of drills and deployments etching deeper grooves into the base's unyielding routine. The Hereford rain came and went in fits, mirroring the subtle undercurrents that now defined Ellis Harper's place within the platoon. Mornings began as always, with the sharp crack of reveille slicing through the fog-shrouded square, boots aligning in precise ranks under Sergeant Major Reynolds' watchful eye. But where once her position in the formation drew sidelong glances of indifference or mockery, now it elicited quiet nods, the hierarchy's invisible threads pulling tighter around her, with a respect born of revelation rather than rank. Ellis led her section through the navigation exercises with the same economy of motion, her voice on the radio steady and clipped, directing flanks through the bracken-choked hills without raising above a murmur. "Bearing 250, adjust for drift." The privates followed without question, their earlier hesitations dissolved into the discipline of trust. Corporal Tate handled the rear with seamless coordination, his briefings incorporating her insights on exfil routes, lessons drawn from that shadowed ridge in Helmand, shared only in fragments that hinted at depths without exposing them. Reynolds oversaw it all from the observation post, his clipboard notations now including her name more frequently, the commendation from the SAS liaison woven into evaluations that spoke of potential for warrant officer stripes. In the mess hall, the atmosphere had thawed incrementally, the clatter of trays and steam from urns of tea providing a constant backdrop to conversations that included her without forcing it. Lance Corporal Mills often joined her at the central table, poring over signals, protocols over slices of fruitcake. Her questions met with Ellis's reserved responses. Frequency hopping counters the interference. Test it on the next sim. No probing into the past. The platoon's curiosity had settled into acceptance, the whispers of echo fading into the background hum like the distant rumble of Land Rovers on the access road. Even the cooks nodded as she passed the hatch. A subtle acknowledgement in the extra rasher of bacon slipped onto her plate, unremarked upon, but felt. Jenkins's transformation was quieter still. A personal reckoning played out in the margins. He no longer claimed the rear of the formation with his mates, instead volunteering for the night watches Ellis once took alone, his posture during inspection straighter, his responses to Reynolds' barks prompt and without the former edge. One evening, after a grueling tab across the South Downs, Bergens heavy with simulated loads, the cold air biting through jackets, he approached her during the stand-down, water bottle in hand. "Harper," he said, voice low, eyes meeting hers for the first time since the vehicle park. "That pace you set, solid, saved us time on the crest." It was no apology voiced outright, just the offering of the bottle and a nod, his pallor replaced by the weathered tan of shared exertion. Ellis accepted it with a brief "ta," the exchange closing a chapter without fanfare, the shame's residue absorbed into the platoon's forward march. The base's broader rhythm reflected the change in microcosm. During a joint exercise with elements from the attached reconnaissance troop, the adjutant referenced her contributions in the pre-brief, his tone carrying the weight of institutional memory. Harper's protocols on the QRF integration, implement as standard. The visiting NCOs, faces lined from tours in the same shadowed theaters, exchanged glances that spoke of recognition, their salutes to her during handovers crisp and lingering. The CO summoned her periodically for quiet words in his office, the pipe tobacco scent now mingled with fresh reports, discussions turning to advancement opportunities, perhaps a posting back to the regiment's orbit, though she demurred with the restraint of one content in the present. "Hereford suits, sir," she replied, her gaze steady, the winged dagger tattoo a silent affirmation beneath her cuff. Evenings brought reflection in the perimeter jogs, the flood-lit paths winding past the training towers, where SAS shadows trained unseen. The air off the Y carried the earthy tang of damp fields, grounding her thoughts as the hills loomed dark against the sky. The scar on her collar, once a hidden reminder of grazing rounds and pulled troopers, felt like a badge integrated, no longer isolated by silence. In the barrack room, as lights dimmed and the platoon settled, soft conversations of family leaves and upcoming rotations, her bunk became a nexus, privates seeking advice on rifle maintenance or endurance pacing, their tones deferential. The ghost epithet retired to barracks lore as a prelude to legend. Credenhill's quiet professionalism endured, its rigid hierarchy a bulwark against the world's chaos, boots echoing on the parade square at dawn, the clipped tones of sergeants major cutting through the cold air over Aldershot-inspired yards. Moral courage expressed not in grand gestures, but in the internal resolve that held ranks together. Ellis embodied that silent honor, her path from mocked reserve to quiet pillar, a testament to the injustice met with unbreaking poise, public recognition transforming not just her standing, but the platoon's ethos. In the regiment's world of classified missions and unspoken debts, such legacies fortified the unyielding stone of British discipline, ensuring that true valor, subtle, internal, reserved, echoed through the rain-swept grounds, an enduring light in the disciplined shadows. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and justice within the ranks. Thank you for watching the case of He Slapped Her Beret Off, then Turned Pale. When the SAS commander walked in and said her name, see you in the next one.